Introduce you, Joe. So before I introduce Joe Tainter, so here is the Energy Symposium today, is Joseph Tainter from Utah State. I will introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker for next week is Suzanne Burton, who is the Managing Director of the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. She is going to give us a talk about the modern grid and demand response. So she is well versed on issues related to grid management, and electricity operations. So we'll get the perspective of some of these demand side responses and grid management that we're looking for going to the future. So looking forward to that one next week, same time. Today it is it's my great pleasure to have Joseph Tainter, who is a professor of ecology and as well as environment and society at Utah State University. When I was initially in my studies of learning about how energy and the economy and energy and society operate, Joe was early on the list of readings for his Collapse of Complex Societies book from 1988, I believe. And I recommend that reading to anyone trying to understand not only the modern times today, not only the history of energy and society from a historical perspective, but also how it can relate to our modern situation. So I thank Joe for giving us this talk today on energy gain and complexity. He's well known in these areas in his own field, as well as informing the broader community here, as you can see, involved with the United Nations, World Bank, UNESCO, energy systems think tanks like YASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. So his work well-deservedly gets around and influences a lot of people and how they're thinking. So Joe, thank you for being a part of this symposium today. I've now stopped sharing my screen, and feel free to start your presentation. So Joe, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Carrie, for the introduction. Can you hear me now?
I hear you fine.
Okay. I may have to ask everyone to be patient today because this Zoom stuff is fairly new to me, and in fact, Carrie's been sort of walking me through it. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to give this talk today.
Go ahead and share the screen, Joe.
I'm sorry?
Just go ahead and share your screen slides.
Yes. Okay, is everyone seeing then my PowerPoint?
Yes. Go ahead and make it full screen if you can.
I'm working on that. There we go. Okay.
Excellent.
All right. So the talk today reflects my long-term interest. I'm a social scientist, and particularly a historical scientist, with a long-term interest in understanding how and why human societies grow more complex. And what is the connection of complexity to energy and the evolution of human societies. And to show that interest, I've developed this little graphic on the right side of the screen, which I call the energy complexity spiral, simply showing that energy and complexity at some level tend to co-vary. As one increases, the other increases, and if one decreases, the other has to increase also. Now, the problem I want to address today is what links a number of cases that you would not ordinarily think would be connected. And the cases are fungus farming ants, the Maya, the Roman Empire, and oil production today. And more importantly, to ask the question, what does this mean for us? I'm going to start with the understanding that not all potential energy is equally useful. Now, I think I'm addressing a mixed audience today. Probably a lot of you are well-versed in energy issues, but I think there may be some people joining in who are not versed in energy issues. So we'll go over some basic material. And so for those of you who are well-versed in energy issues, I'll ask for your forbearance. So we start from the concept that not all potential energy is equally useful. And what matters is what's called energy return on investment, which is characterized by the acronym EROI. Energy return on investment refers to energy returned on energy invested, not monetary investment. It takes energy to get energy, and what matters most is the energy gain, the energy returned on the energy invested. The concept of energy gain is the basis of the case studies I'm going to discuss today. I want to acknowledge that this first case study, which will be on fungus farming ants, was done in collaboration with my colleague Tim Allen, who's now retired from the University of Wisconsin. So fungus farming ants evolved about 50 million years ago in the moist lowlands of South America, and they farm fungi on various substrates that are collected and brought into the nest. They are actually agriculturalists. Now, which substrate they use determines both their energy gain and the complexity of their social structure. The critical element is nitrogen, which the fungi need to grow. To give some examples, there are a small species of ants, actually a genus, Myrmecocrypta, that use a substrate consisting of insect droppings, mainly from caterpillars, insect carcasses, and occasional bits of vegetal material. Now, the insect droppings are of particular interest. They're rich in nitrogen, and so they're of comparatively high quality as a substrate for the fungus. The problem with insect droppings is that they're a highly processed resource, several transformations removed from the sun, with the process going from sun to plants to grasshoppers to droppings to ants. And in any energy transformation, about 90% is lost at each transformation, at each step, lost to heat. So what that means is that droppings are in short supply. So high quality as droppings may be, they're not abundant, and finding them depends simply on chance foraging. These ants simply forage out from their nests in a seemingly random manner until they come across something worth bringing back to the nest as a substrate for the fungus that they're growing. So Myrmecocrypta, you can see from the scale on the illustration, the photograph to the right, that they are really quite small. They depend on a resource that's high in quality, but it's limited in quantity. And the limited supply limits the sizes of the colonies of these ants. The Myrmecocrypta are small. Their social structure is simple. They exhibit no differences in body morphology. They live in colonies of perhaps 100 to 150 insects. As I say, simple social structure. And their foraging radius is small, up to maybe 1 to 1.5 meters from the nest. Although given how small the individual ants are, this is actually quite a distance. Now, there are other fungus farming ants, such as those of the genus Atta, that cut leaves for the substrate on which the fungus grows. And these are the classic leaf cutters with trails up to 100 meters long. And I encountered these a number of years ago on a trip to Costa Rica, spending a little bit of time in the rainforest there. And these were the most impressive thing I saw in the tropical rainforest in Costa Rica. And when you come across one of these trails, you look to your left and you look to your right, and they're just ants as far as you can see in either direction. They're very, very impressive features. Now, leaves are closer to the sun than caterpillar droppings, with the energy transformation being simply sun to plants. They've gone through fewer transformations from solar energy, but the resource quality is low. The nitrogen has not been concentrated as it was in things like caterpillar droppings. Now, fungi range from 3 to 4% nitrogen and require nitrogen to grow. So nitrogen is ultimately the primary energy source. Dung ranges from 1 to 2.5% nitrogen, while leaves contain 0.5 to 0.8% nitrogen. So leaves, as you can see from these comparative figures, are a low quality resource, but they're abundant because they're removed from solar energy by only a few transformations. Now, since droppings are 2 to 5 times higher in nitrogen than leaves, leaf cutters must transport great quantities of the resource to make up the difference. Colonies of excrement collectors may gather from 40 to, let's say, 150 grams of substrate per month, while ATA on average haul close to 77 kilograms of leaf fragments per month over greatly longer distances. And this explains their famous trails. So leafcutters haul anywhere from 500 to 1900 times as much weight per colony per month as the dropping collectors haul. Now, in an attempt to quantify this, I try to quantify it as multiples of body length that they have to haul the substrate. Myrmecocrypta with a body length of, let's say, about 7.5 millimeters and a foraging radius of 1 meter must forage up to 133 times their body length, while ATA, with a body length of 1 centimeter and a foraging radius of 60 meters, must transport leaves something like 6,000 times their body length. So moving so much low-quality substrate among ATA imposes a need for organization. And the most prominent aspect of this organization, of course, is the trails themselves, which are, as I said, are often prominent features of tropical forests. Now, the need to aggregate large quantities of a low-quality resource imposes complexity of organization throughout leafcutter societies. And this organization imposes the further cost of supporting insects that are not directly involved in producing food. The very large colonies, up to millions of insects, are needed for economies of scale. The social structure, in turn, is complex, with different body sizes corresponding to specialized functions: queen, foragers, leafcutters, soldiers, and gardeners. The largest ants are 300 times the size of the smallest ones, and they're all substantially larger than Myrmecocrypta. So keep in mind that the Myrmecocrypta, the fungus, the dung collectors, the grasshopper dropping collectors, have very small colonies and simple social structure, whereas ATA, who are transporting enormous quantities of a low-quality resource, require very large colonies for economies of scale and to offset low EROI, and they require a complex social system. So among the ants that collect droppings, ecosystem processes concentrate the nitrogen, whereas leafcutters must concentrate it themselves. And then this forces the leafcutter societies to be large and complex, a direct consequence of low EROI. And you can see in the left-hand picture here some of the differences in body size in the leafcutter ants. That largest one, I think, is a soldier ant, and the smaller one is just a worker. And in the right-hand side, that dark red blob going almost from the top to bottom, I believe that's a queen. So there's an important question to ask about the evolution of these ant societies, and which came first, the dropping collectors or the leafcutters. Now, it's worth noting that the excrement collectors, such as Myrmecocrypta, appear from mitochondrial DNA to be the closest thing to the long-distant first species of fungus farmers, while ATA are the most distant from this founding species. So the emergence of the species that cut and transport leaves was a secondary development. The use of low-quality leaves followed and derived from the initial use of higher quality substrates. So the complexity of leafcutters is also secondary, with organization deriving from the need to move and process large quantities of raw material. Now, since ATA must travel further and maintain large body sizes and complex social systems to process leaves, their energy returned on energy invested is lower than for excrement collectors. So what we see is that then high EROI and low organization preceded low EROI and high organization. Okay, we'll move on to the second case study, which does not actually concern energy, but other resources, specifically water. But still, we're looking at the concept of gain, of return on effort here. This is the famous Maya site of Tikal. So this case study involves Maya water control, specifically the evolution from what my colleague Vern Scarborough, who's developed these illustrations that you see here, calls concave micro watersheds in what's called the late pre-classic period, and I'll clarify that in a moment, to convex micro watersheds in the classic period. And you can see in these illustrations here that the top illustration shows what's called a convex micro watershed, and the bottom illustration shows the concave micro watershed. The late classic period, which extends from about 400 BC to 200 AD, the period of concave micro watersheds, the illustration at the top, employed a passive system to capture seasonal rainfall and channel it for future use. They were settling in the bottom of depressions and for the most part collecting water as it filtered down through natural processes with minimal attempts to channel it in storage, or with fewer attempts to channel it in storage. In contrast, in this period, the people used natural sinks or depressions into which the water would naturally run. Communities were situated to capture seasonal water and store it for future use. So it was primarily a passive system employing the natural subsidies of geology and gravity. In the classic period, shown in the lower illustration there, people relocated to higher ground, and the land was engineered to catch, channel, and store water. And at the same time, reflecting the increasing importance of water, it appears that water rituals became grander and more public. Now, this is a rather difficult to understand illustration of classic water control at the major Maya center of Tikal. But if you look around at the blue ponds, you can see that, in fact, they were storing water just about any place where the landscape permitted it. But these were not natural concentrations of water. They had to build canals to channel the water to these locations. So the land was engineered then to catch and store water. This required public construction and imposed the cost of continuous maintenance. At the same time, my colleague Lisa Lucero has argued that water rituals became grander and more public, which means that they would also have become more costly. So employing the framework of resource gain, we can see that in the late pre-classic, nature, in the form of geology and gravity, did most of the concentrating of the valuable resource, water. The resource was therefore a subsidy with high benefits and low costs. And this meant that organization could be comparatively low. In the classic, there was higher investment. Humans sculpted the landscape to concentrate the resource. Water use was lower gain and more costly. This led to more complex organization and a lower resource return on investment. Through time, other changes occurred in Maya agriculture, along with the increasing investments in water control and water management. Agriculture went through intensification, increasing land modification, and increasing management. In other words, the system evolved from higher to lower gain, from higher to lower resource return on investment, into diminishing returns. And this is the typical evolutionary pattern of resource extraction systems. Okay, we move on to a discussion of the evolution of energy gain in the Roman Empire, which went along the same trajectory of high to low. Now, it's of both scientific and practical interest to observe that systems as superficially different as fungus farming ants, the Maya, and the Roman Empire actually underwent similar courses of development in response to declining return on investment. And we start out with the phase of Roman expansion, which was mostly in the last few centuries BC. Beginning in the first few centuries AD, they did less expanding. The empire pretty much found its maximum extent. In this period, in the period of expansion, when the Romans conquered a province, they would take for themselves what amounted to the products of past solar energy, embodied in precious metals, works of art, and people. They would then use these stores of solar energy to finance more conquests. As the conquered peoples paid the cost of further expansion, this was a strategy that yielded high eroi. Now, it's important to emphasize, I can't emphasize this point importantly enough. In 167 BC, for example, the Romans captured the Macedonian treasury and thereafter eliminated taxation of themselves. Now, that's an extraordinary event. The Romans eliminated taxation of themselves, and yet the empire continued to expand. What they were doing was that the conquered people paid the cost of further expansion. So, to give some examples, the state budget doubled when the kingdom of Pergamon in what's now Turkey was annexed in 130 BC. When the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria, the state budget was raised another 70%. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, the value of Gaul in Rome fell by 36%. Now, high eroi phases in human systems usually don't last long, and expansion can't go on forever. Eventually, any empire reaches limits beyond which further conquests are either not possible or not worth the cost. By the 1st century AD, Rome had reached this point, and that precipitated profound changes in Rome's energy return on investment. Now, for the Romans, the logical empire would have been the Mediterranean and the lands immediately fringing the Mediterranean, that they could administer and communicate with and ship goods around fairly easily. When they began expanding into northwestern Europe, they had success in conquering Gaul and Britain, but then continued attempts to expand into northern Europe were less successful. On occasion, they would conquer some areas, but then after a while give it up as not worth the effort that it took to hold on to it. So basically, the Roman Empire reached a point where they were out of the high gain phase. They reached a point where they were no longer conquering new peoples. Now, when expansion ends, an imperial structure that then is built up on the income of conquest has to sustain itself on yearly solar energy production. So we transition to what we call a low gain phase. So for a one-time influx of wealth from each conquest, Rome had to undertake military and administrative responsibilities that lasted centuries. And these had enormous consequences. The empire shifted from high eroi, that is, living off stored solar energy, much as we do, to low eroi, living off yearly solar energy transformed into agricultural products. Now, the empire's economy and the government's budget came almost entirely from agriculture. Agriculture is estimated to have been about 90% of the empire's, the government's budget. So once expansion stopped and they had to rely on annual solar energy, there were almost immediate fiscal problems. So we find during the first 2 centuries AD, there were repeated fiscal crises. The first emperor, Augustus, often had to relieve the state budget from his own wealth, but that came from the one-time conquest of Egypt. So yearly solar energy was not enough to run the empire. In the low-gain imperial phase, there was often not enough precious metal in the treasury to run the empire, of which the main cost was the army. So in 64 AD, faced with a war in the east and the cost of rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire, the Emperor Nero began a strategy that later emperors found irresistible. He debased the primary silver coin, the denarius, lowering the precious metal content from 98 to 93%. Now, as this chart shows, this was a first step down a slippery slope that resulted 2 centuries later in a currency that was worthless with less than about 2% silver and a government that was insolvent. Debasing the currency was an attempt to escape the constraints of yearly agricultural production, but of course it shifted current costs onto the future, much as governments do today with deficit spending. So when the silver content of coins had declined from 98 to 2%, this strategy was basically exhausted. Fiscal distress coincided in the 3rd century AD with a 50-year crisis that nearly brought the empire to an end. There were chronic civil wars with something like 50 usurpers over a 50-year period, invasions of Germanic peoples from the north and the Persians from the east. Cities were sacked and frontier provinces were devastated. And in the 260s, the East and West actually broke away into rival empires. Well, the response coming in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries was to increase the size and complexity of both the government and the military. Provinces were subdivided, and the bureaucracy and army grew in size. Occupations were regulated, and guilds were conscripted into providing products that the empire needed. The cost was met by increasing greatly the level of taxation, which is to say by appropriating a greater fraction of the empire's annual solar energy. So, emperors of this period, as I say, they subdivided provinces, and the purpose of that was to prevent emperors from rebelling. They expanded the size of the government, and the number of capital cities went from 1 to, at sometimes, 4. The empire was increasingly ruled by separate governments in the east and the west. The emperors also doubled the size of the army. As I said, that was the major cost in the government budget, and increased the proportion of cavalry, cavalry being particularly expensive. There were also increasing controls on behavior. Workers were frozen into hereditary occupations that the government deemed essential, including the army. The government conscripted workers and guilds for such things as shipping and building new walls around cities. Farmers were tied to their plots. If you were a farmer, you could not leave. And if you were a farmer, your son had to be a farmer unless he was fortunate enough to join the army. Now, most remarkable of all, the government assessed every plot of land across the entire empire. That means every field, every orchard, every pasture for tax. Now, imagine doing this across an area of the roughly equivalent in area to the United States without mechanical transportation. Now, this had to be done within a few years, and the recording alone must have been an enormous task. These changes in structure and organization amounted to increasing the complexity of the Roman Empire. As the second law of thermodynamics tells us, increasing complexity always carries a metabolic cost, and this was paid through increasing taxes. So to make up for shortfalls of energy, taxes on agriculture were raised again and again. In the late empire, taxes would take anywhere from 50 to 67% of a peasant's net production above seed and subsistence, or all net production in bad years. And this is a very high rate of taxation for subsistence farmers. The increase in solar energy had consequences that ultimately undercut the empire's survival. Population declined. After plagues in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was little recovery. Shortages of labor persisted in many critical areas, and this is why the government was freezing people into hereditary occupations, including in the army. During this period, if you were a soldier, your sons had to be soldiers too. As I say, people were frozen into hereditary occupations that provided the goods and services that the empire needed. Tax rates were so high that peasants could accumulate no reserves nor support large families. And so what you find is that marginal lands went out of production, even though the empire tried continually to force farmers to cultivate all land. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was surviving by consuming its capital resources, productive land, and peasant population. This was clearly unsustainable, and the Western Empire soon went to its predictable end. One lesson of the Roman Empire is that at the system level, low EROI imposes higher costs per capita. We can see in the cases of both fungus farming ants and agrarian empires, low gain energy requires organization to aggregate the small margins of net production. Now let's go on to energy production today. The photo at the left is Signal Hill in 1929 in California, and the right is Perdido. There's an interesting story about oil production in this area. In 1892, an unsuccessful prospector by the name of Edward Doheny found oil near Los Angeles at a depth of 140 meters. Now that in itself is not remarkable. The part of the story that I've always liked is that he drilled the hole using the sharpened end of a eucalyptus tree. Obviously, we're never again going to produce oil using eucalyptus trees. We'll never again produce oil so easily. The biggest problem of any extractive industry is depletion of its most accessible reserves. This is called the best first principle. In the oil industry, this means drilling deeper and in more remote places. The first well in Titusville, Pennsylvania hit oil at a depth of 21 meters. In the 1920s, wells were being drilled to 2,500 meters. And today, wells can be drilled as deep as 12,000 meters. In 2014, global exploration and production expenditures exceeded $700 billion. As you can see from the chart from the slide here, as we look for oil in remote and risky places, EROI declines. According to the calculations by Cutler Cleveland, U.S. EROI in 1940 produced oil at a rate of 100 to 1, and today that's down to about 15 to 1. So, as we spend more and more to go deeper and deeper, the net energy we get back progressively declines. With oil, the highest energy gain comes from pools that are large, shallow, and easily accessed, what are called elephants in the industry. Pools that are small or in places that are deep, dark, what I call deep, dark, cold, remote, and dangerous, require complexity. Technological complexity, administrative complexity, and logistical complexity to find and extract, and this lowers EROI. Now, oil is definitely a high gain resource. Past ecosystems and geological processes concentrated the resource for us. But although oil is high gain, its EROI still varies. And oil, like any other resource, undergoes a transition from higher gain to lower gain. Now, this is the rig called Perdido, which is owned by Shell. From what I understand, its actual cost is proprietary, but it's rumored to be in the neighborhood of $3 billion. It's a perfect example of using organization to aggregate smaller margins of net production. Perdido can pump oil from 35 wells across 30 miles of ocean floor at a rate of up to 130,000 barrels a day. It's a very impressive piece of machinery. And it can do all this while simultaneously drilling new wells. Its deepest well lies in 9,600 feet of water. Perdido's arms, which you can see here snaking out in all directions, organize the undersea landscape to concentrate production. Because of EROI, both oil producers and fungus farming ants have converged on the same evolutionary strategy, increasing complexity to aggregate lower gain energy. Perdido's arms extending out across the ocean floor are the functional equivalent of trails of leafcutter ants, or the great ships bringing grain to Rome. So, to summarize the relationship of EROI to complexity, low EROI and a need to aggregate resources drive increasing complexity. When margins of net production decline, there's a need for increasing organization to aggregate resources to accomplish societal work. This is a common evolutionary process, as I've tried to show in this talk. It's evident in fungus farming ants, water management, agrarian empires, and oil exploration. The high and low gain systems have different consequences and different characteristics. In high gain systems, the resource is abundant and concentrated. The resource subsidizes human activity. Use can be inefficient, as has been our experience with oil, and there's little or no incentive to conserve. But high gain resources may be quickly depleted, so that high gain phases in human societies tend to be short, as the age of petroleum will be. In low gain systems, resources are dispersed and often scarce. Yet the resource may last a very long time, exemplified, for example, in subsistence agriculture. But there's little surplus per capita. The consuming system must provide the organization to aggregate the resource, and this requires complex organization. And use has to be increasingly efficient. Now, there's common thinking that our future energy will come from renewable resources, but renewables, as I think this audience clearly knows, have low energy density. They take a lot of land and yield low EROI. Note, for example, the figure for photovoltaic in Spain toward the top of the chart there, with an EROI of 2.45 to 1, based on the calculations of Pedro Prieto and Charles Hall. Note also tar sands and shale, which yield fairly low EROI. Other energy sources will make us vulnerable to problems of complexity and costliness that affect low-gain energy systems in the cases we've discussed. And Charles Hall has estimated that we need an EROI of at least 5 to 1 to sustain the industrial way of life. The trend toward declining EROI has enormous implications for our future. This is a chart that I know many of you are familiar with. It's called the energy cliff. It shows that as the energy profit from producing energy declines with declining EROI, at about 7 to 8% profit at the right-hand part of the curve, the profit on energy production goes off the cliff. And if we ever reach this point, so does our economy. So I'll conclude with two implications from this discussion. The first is that changes in energy gain help to explain the evolution of complexity in human and other societies. Where the margin of net production is low, and a society needs to aggregate resources to perform work, complexity will increase. We find that this is a recurrent pattern across human evolution, including today. The second implication, of course, concerns our own future. We must consider the likelihood that our future may consist of, first, low EROI energy, secondly, higher cost energy, third, higher complexity, and perhaps fourth, economic stagnation. Now, among those who discuss future energy, many foresee an idyllic future of renewable energy that is clean. Yet, because it requires great land areas, renewable energy may be more environmentally damaging than what we do now. Finally, we need to consider whether a future of low EROI energy will allow us to sustain the way of life to which we are accustomed. I thank you, and that is the end of the talk.
Thank you, Joe. Again, I'm going to, you preempted a lot of my questions. I'll still attempt to start with one. I'll encourage the audience to please type in the webinar chat or the Q&A if you have questions, and I might just start opening up the ability for people to speak if they have a question, just to make sure we're able to communicate some well. So I'll start with a question and then maybe open it up. Certainly at any time someone can ask a question, and I might open it up for people to use their microphones in order to ask questions as we go forward. So Joe, you did a good job of relating your studies to the modern system, or how we might think about going to renewable energy technologies like wind, solar, and these kinds of things. And of course, the idea of net energy and complexity. So comment on, I guess, on this question. Are there, as I think of it, there are maybe two ways to increase EROI. One, let's just say you had a new technology and found a new resource, and it's great. Let's just go in from agrarian society to fossil fuels. We have a new high gain resource, and we seemingly just expand into it. Is this inevitable? Do societies, whether they're ants or humans, just inevitably say, I'm going to expand into this high EROI resource? That's the first question. The second is, if you're hitting limits and that you can no longer grow because of limits in net energy or EROI, the decrease in complexity is a way to actually increase the EROI, in the sense of, if you have less energy left over for, let's just say, me as a consumer to go do what I want and drive and go on vacation, essentially limiting my ability to do that will inevitably make the EROI of the society go up. Just because there's less net energy for me to drive around on vacation, by definition, the EROI would go up with the same industrial society going on at the same time. So hopefully you can understand both those two questions, but I'll clarify if needed. So go ahead and.
Well, I think your first question was about discovering and possibly using a higher gain energy source, such as happened with our discovery of fossil fuels, transitioning from solar energy to fossil fuels. That is a matter of luck. I've studied the evolution of complexity and warfare in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and what I see is a system that was going the way of the Roman Empire. They were engaged, the European nations were engaged in war so continuously in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that the cost of being those societies was simply going up and up and up. And they were doing this on an economy that was no more developed than that of the Roman Empire. Well, two things happened that saved them, from collapsing. One is that they explored out into the oceans and found whole new worlds to conquer, particularly North and South America, and to take the resources of those worlds and shift them over to support complexity in Europe. And then the second thing that happened was the discovery, first of fossil fuels, and then of course, nuclear. And these were one-off cases of serendipity that they can't be repeated. Is there a renewable energy source out there? I don't know. As the saying goes, fusion is the energy of the future, and it always will be. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a technical specialist, so I can't really comment on whether or not we will be able to rely someday on fusion or on breeder reactors. But what I will say is that, based on what I see of human history, when we have abundant energy, we find ways to use it up. And certainly you can see that in the case of how we responded to the development of fossil fuels. Carrie, you'll have to remind me, what was your second question?
Oh, this second one was a little bit more towards the decreasing complexity and relation to net energy idea. And in my view, let's just say Charlie Hall's idea is right. You need a EROI of 5. If the resources aren't allowing that for the current structure of society, then that is essentially the impetus for the current structure of society to break down to some degree. Let's just say me and no longer being able to go on vacation, then the EROI of society would go back up to 5, but I'm doing fewer things because the society is just less complex in that sense.
Okay, if I understand the question, you're asking me if complexity can be voluntarily decreased. And I think the answer I would give to that was how impressed I was watching the things that BP was doing during the technology that BP was doing to try to control the Deepwater Horizon blowout. This technology is incredible. I mean, on one level, I greatly admire it. It's brilliant technology. It's highly complex. The safety system, just as one example of the complexity, the safety systems on Deepwater Horizon required flipping something like 10 different switches. Well, no one who's in fear of their lives is going to do that. The complexity can't be decreased. Once you achieve a certain level of complexity, the only way to decrease complexity is to have what's called a collapse, which I've studied. And a collapse involves a decrease not only in complexity, but also in energy consumption and really in an entire way of life. These are systems that we're talking about where everything is connected to everything else. And with the COVID-19 virus today, we can see, we see clearly how everything is connected to everything else. As restaurant workers are thrown out of work, they can't pay rent on their apartments, which means that apartment owners have less money to spend, which means that whatever stores are open are doing less business, and so forth and so on. It's a downward spiral. It's a positive feedback loop heading downwards. These are complex systems that we're dealing with, and you can't simply make a choice to decrease complexity. The other thing I will point out is that complexity tends to be insidious. Each increment in complexity seems reasonable at the time. Complexity grows. I've argued that complexity primarily grows to solve problems. And each problem at the time seems easily solvable, and the added cost seems reasonable. So that complexity simply grows by small steps, each of which seems reasonable at the time. It's the cumulative costs that do you in, and unless someone's paying attention, those cumulative costs sneak up on you. So, Gary, I hope I've answered your questions.
Yeah, it's fine. We could continue on forever, so I might follow up at the end, but I'll go with some questions that are from the listeners here. One is kind of a comment, but we'll leave it as make it a question. So ancient, there's another person saying, in ancient civilizations, I've found that seed harvested to seed sown, this ratio to be insightful, and looking at, I guess, ancient civilizations. So it was this harvested to sown ratio was higher in Egypt than in the Roman countryside. Do you have any insights into your looking into about?
Well, yes, that's why everyone wanted Egypt.
Yeah,
that's why the Romans wanted it.
Right.
They fought very hard to hang on to it.
Excellent. Here's a couple that are similar, so I'll ask them in tandem. So it's this one here. The future sounds bleak. What can we do now to mitigate this bleak future? So what should we be doing now? This another question which is similar. Do you think a transition from petroleum to renewable resources is favorable? And there's the question here, do you think high gain resources are better for development? I guess you're probably saying yes there, but how do we think about going to renewables, and how do we mitigate effects of maybe reaching diminishing returns on complexity?
Yes, I think the question about renewables was a value judgment, and certainly I think all of us would agree that there are features of renewable energy that are highly desirable, that there are many undesirable aspects to fossil fuels. We all understand this. At the same time, fossil fuels are absolutely necessary today to run our society. In the future of renewable energy, it has many attractive qualities. I have reservations about it. One reservation I have is whether energy production can be rapidly increased in an emergency. The example I like to use was that at the start of World War II, the United States had something like 30% of our oil production capacity simply shut in. I was interested at one point in the consequence of World War II for oil production, and it turns out that we fought World War II simply by opening valves. We simply had that much extra capacity in storage, and so we supplied not only our own oil, but most of the oil that our allies used, and that was a major factor in us winning World War II. But you can't always count on that, and particularly in a future of renewables, where an enormous amount of infrastructure needs to be put in. Is there a capacity to rapidly expand energy production in a situation that would be so different from the ability to rapidly increase production that we had in, say, 1940? It's one reservation I have about renewables, is that I think there are negative consequences to relying on them. At the same time, we are probably going to have to shift to renewables at some point in the future, and certainly there are trends in that direction.
Thanks. I agree with you. This sort of ability to turn the valve on the oil production in Texas was highly valuable, and perhaps getting out of the Great Depression, certainly World War II. The discussion is going on at the Texas Railroad Commission now on whether to prorate oil production. It's going on today. So the future is the past. Again, there's a couple other questions here. I'll go one at a time. So there's a question: did this person understand you to say that in the historical record, at first, there's abundant energy that permits complex societal structure, while subsequently complex societal structure was increasingly geared towards organizing energy harvesting itself? That is to say, complexity is first expansive, allows you to expand, and later it's used simply to solve the problems that it created itself. Is that a fair statement?
I argue that complexity increases for two reasons. One is that abundant energy allows complexity to grow, because if you give humans abundant energy, we find ways to use it up. And you can see something similar in ecosystems. If you somehow introduce a new form of energy to an ecosystem, it won't just sit there. Something will come along to use it up. The complexity of the system will increase. It's the same with us, that if you provide humans with more energy, complexity will grow. The problem with relying on that, or the problem with using that as an explanation of human history, is that we've rarely had abundant energy. Particularly during the period when we were reliant on solar energy, there have been very few periods when we've had abundant energy. And in fact, those periods are so rare that we use special terms to designate them, like the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. Most of the time, I argue that complexity increases to solve problems, that when problems are encountered, increase in complexity by small steps seems reasonable, and there's a desire to solve the problem. Take as an example how we have responded to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. We've increased complexity. We developed new government agencies, the Transportation Security Administration, for example. We've reorganized others, and we've increased organization in the form of constraints on behavior. We experience this every time we go through a security line at the airport. So I argue that complexity can grow from abundant energy, but this is rare in human history, and most of the time complexity grows from responding to problems, so that the energy then has to follow, that we undertake increasing complexity to solve problems, and then the energy to support it, we simply have to develop subsequently the energy to support it.
Thank you. I'm now going to attempt, as a couple of people have their hands up to speak, so I'm going to try to go to them one at a time and push the button that allows this. So I think I've allowed this for one person, so I'll just use the initials MR. Can you speak, and can we hear you?
Yes, I
Go
can. Thank you
ahead.
for giving me the opportunity. I was actually typing in my comments just in case you prefer to read them out yourself. But if given the chance, I can express my concern myself. So thank you very much for the talk. I enjoyed the talk very much. I was actually fortunate enough to witness some of your talks over the years live, and they're invariably very inspiring and impressive. I do have a couple of comments. I'll try and be quick and concise. I think there's an important caveat to be made with regards to the minimum EROI that may or may not be required in the future to support modern society. And some of that will be co-determined, at least to some degree, by the efficiency at which the energy carriers that are used throughout society are converted into useful work. So, for example, if you go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, humans may have had access to very high EROI resources, such as very easily accessible coal seams and whatnot. But we should also remember that Watt's original steam engine was about 1% efficient. So a lot of that easily accessible energy just went up into, quite literally, smoke and heat, and very little of it was actually put to useful work. And even modern processes and modern engines and thermal processes, such as typical power plant, thermal power plant, or an engine for a vehicle such as a car, they're rarely more efficient. They're about 30 to 35%. And that's a hard limit imposed by thermodynamics, known as the Carnot limit, right? Instead, a future society that conceivably would rely more and more, and possibly at some point almost completely, on electricity as an energy carrier. On one hand, of course, it will have to be more complex to be able to use electricity for everything. So it's not as straightforward to use electricity as it may have been back in the day to use some crude forms of thermal fuel. And so that will inevitably make societies slightly more brittle and less able to recover, perhaps in the case of some global wars, pandemics, and stuff like that. But at the same time, I believe that such a future society will also be able to benefit from vastly more efficient processes. Like electric motors in electric vehicles can be roughly 90% efficient as opposed to 30%. And the same goes for electricity produced by renewables for the grid. You go straight from resource to electricity at a conversion efficiency of 80–90%. Whereas, sidestepping completely the thermal step, which is kind of the rate limiting step, or the efficiency limiting step. So that goes at least some way towards compensating for the dwindling EROI of conventional resources, I think. So that would be my comment. And also, related, we should be wary of comparing across different energy carriers as though they were interchangeable. And I'm always a little skeptical of simplified comparisons across oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, and hydro, and wind, and whatnot, because a lump of coal, fat chance of powering up your computer with a lump of coal, unless you go ahead and transport it and burn it in a power plant. And then lo and behold, if you do that, the return on investment is significantly lower. So yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Margot. Any thoughts on that? Joe, I
do have thoughts on that. It seems to me that Mario is asking something about whether innovation will save the day. And that's a topic I've worked on quite a bit in the last few years. There are conventional economists and technological optimists who argue that we never need to be concerned about resources. Resources are never scarce, they're just priced wrong. All we need is the market and the price mechanism, and for the government to stay out of the way. And there will always be innovations in technology or in energy sources or in ways to use energy that will always bail us out. And certainly to this point, the technological optimists have been correct. As we deplete resources, the price actually stays constant or goes down. And it's quite a remarkable thing when you stop and think about it. As we deplete finite resources, the price doesn't go up. The price of coal has been constant for the last 150 years, adjusted for inflation. So some colleagues and I undertook to study whether we can expect this to continue in the future. It seems to me that the technological optimists make an assumption that they're not aware that they're making. The assumption is that the productivity of innovation will be, excuse me, that innovation will be as productive in the future as it is today. So we undertook to measure trends in the productivity of innovation over time. Innovation is like any human system. It grows complex and costly over time. And what we have found using a database of over 3 million patents is that the productivity of our system of innovation is actually declining. It is costing more and more to innovate. And over a period of the last generation or so, over the last 30 years, the productivity of innovation has actually declined by over 20%. Now, if it continues to do that in the future, 20% every generation, you can see that the day will come when innovation is not going to bail us out. That certainly by the end of the century, we will not be able to rely on innovation to the extent that we have in the past, that innovation will simply be too expensive and too unproductive.
All right, thanks. Let's go to a couple more here on the typed questions. Thinking about energy return on investment and the concept of time, or at least how the calculations are done and how resources are used over time. This is the question here. Current time basis is typically small, maybe 10 or 20 years or of some system characteristic, or the life of a well, or the life of a technology perhaps. Much of the energy that's embodied in technology, say in renewable systems, is in their process materials, and so perhaps they can last longer, 40 years, something like this maybe. Let's see, plus we can recycle these things, can make renewable technologies and figure out ways to recycle them, even including their complex and refined materials. This is contrasted to the many single-use cycles found in fossil fuel systems. In terms of the combustion itself, the fossil fuel is burned. The refined wellbore of materials are buried and maybe harder to extract up again, say if we wanted to get the steel drilling pipe up. So this person writing diminishing return is the nature of fossil fuel systems, is maybe by their nature. Renewable energy systems are still improving in their efficiency with addition of knowledge, methods of using them, and the complexity of designing them and integrating them. So it seems a question we should fear. Are we transitioning quickly enough to assure energy-dense fossil fuels are invested efficiently into renewable systems? So long-winded question there. How do we think about fossil fuels, using them to go into renewables and recycling? Any thoughts?
Okay, well, I will take the core of your question to be, are we transitioning quickly enough? And of course, it's very hard to answer. All I can say is that I am more encouraged now than I was 10 years ago. Again, though, I think we come down to the problem of innovation and whether we can expect innovation to continue to advance at the rate it has been. My colleagues and I have shown that within a generation or two, it's not going to.
Okay. Can you give any insight into this? You say we're not innovating as fast. How do you know we're not innovating as fast as we used to, or not fast enough, say, renewables?
Our measure of productivity is patents per inventor. What we show is that it is taking more and more innovators to achieve a patent, and the converse of that is patents per inventor. This is a measure of cost. Number of inventors is an indirect measure of cost. And the reason for this is that complexity of research is increasing. Research is now interdisciplinary, whereas in the past it might involve, one or two scholars. I noticed this years ago, back in the 1970s, you could look at an issue of Science and there'd be one author per paper, and you look now and there's 8 to 10 authors per paper, including the janitor. That's just the direction that research has gone. It's become increasingly complex and increasingly costly. And you see this in the patent system. So our measure is patents, excuse me, patents per inventor. And what I will mention is that is equivalent to the standard definition of productivity in the economy as a whole, output per worker.
Right, thank you. Maybe we'll try for a couple more here and wrap it up in 5 minutes or so. So there's someone commenting on your Roman Empire example. Exploiting the Romans, exploiting from Gaul clearly was useful for the Romans in terms of conquering some area and getting their resources, but very bad for the Gauls. So is every single energy or return on investment type concept, whether energy or otherwise, is this going to be detrimental for some other group with respect to the group getting the gain? Is there always a winner and loser? Is it detrimental for another group, another environment, or another ecosystem? Then it benefits the ones that's doing the, I guess, quote unquote, conquering. Are these sort of by nature exploitive? Or can we be more like ants and have our own form of investment as well? Like, I suppose maybe the ants are exploiting the environment, but any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the last part, but as far as who benefited from human expansion, clearly the Romans did. And my analysis is from the Romans' point of view. Their challenge was, it was a sustainability challenge. How do we sustain this entity? How do we sustain the Roman Empire? And the steps they took to undertake it, to sustain it, the steps they undertook involved increasing complexity and increasing costliness and ultimately diminishing returns. They were a society that was essentially spending more and more just to stay the same. And when you spend more and more to stay the same, that's a society in trouble. As far as the Gauls are concerned, I think you could argue one way or another. Gallic peasants could be ruled by their own chieftains, or they could be ruled by Roman governors. I don't know that it mattered one way or the other, except that Roman taxes were certainly quite high. And initially the transition to Roman rule was probably difficult for the Gauls. There were rebellions in Gaul in the mid-1st century AD.
Right. Okay, well, and on a question you maybe didn't address directly, but the idea of the Jevons paradox or the rebound effect, that more gains in efficiency simply allow the system to expand and consume more rather than less at the system level. So can this be countered through policy, or how have you thought about the rebound effect in your studies of complexity in society?
Yeah, well, I've seen some suggestions. Mario Gianpietro had some suggestions for how to counter Jevons paradox. I think one suggestion was you simply take the money and put it in the bank. Of course, the problem there is that the bank simply lends the money out into something that consumes resources, or the government could tax the savings. The problem there is that the government will simply spend the money itself. So other than stuffing your mattress with the money you save, I don't see a way out of the Jevons paradox.
Right. Okay, let's take this last one. This will be the last question here. This one's kind of interesting. So the idea of if we know how to calculate this minimum ROI of society, do you think this can be reduced in terms of society operating at a lower energy return on investment resources? Do you think this can be reduced through better distribution of energy or money, essentially more equality? So the question here is asking, each empire expanded because the elites wanted more, much of the cost of the serfs, much to the costs of the serfs through taxes. So it seems like a solution to the energy crisis we are in today could be an increase in equity per person. So how do we think about complexity and equality, I guess you might say, or equal distribution of resources?
Well, you're asking about an ideal future that I think is not realistic, frankly. And I generally don't try to speculate about ideal solutions.
Right. Some people, this is just me talking now. Some people could claim so communism trying to be equal, that everyone's equally poor, right? This would be a stereotype of that
Right.
situation. So are you implying something like this? Like you can have equality, but maybe if everyone's equally poor, or you're just not sure?
I do think from time to time whether we are heading for a steady state economy. I'm not endorsing that. I simply think, looking at the problem from different angles, that may be where we're headed.
Right. I think we'll leave it there. I tend to agree. We need a lot of studying. This is what I think is happening with a little bit less of better or worse added on to it. If we just need to understand a little bit better what's happening. So, Joe, thank you very much for an insightful talk and answering the questions. Thank you for participants for asking good questions and keeping it lively. The video will be posted in approximately a week on the Energy Institute YouTube site and on the Energy Symposium website, linked from the Energy Institute webpage. Again, thank you very much, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Joe. Enjoyed it very much.